In this lesson, we'll add some motion blur and a few other final touches to our animation sequence. Alright, so now that we have our image-based lighting set up, we're pretty much at a point where we are more or less finished. Now at this point, there's really just a few final little things that we would maybe like to add to this. So one of the things that, as this aircraft starts to speed away, as we take a render of this, either in the interactive render region, you'll notice that there is no sense of anything like motion blur or anything like that. So when it comes to motion blur, this is something that we actually do need to add inside of Cinema 4D. So if I close this out and go back to my render settings, let's come in here and go to Edit Render Settings. If we go down to our effect, there's a couple of different ways of adding motion blur. If you look down toward the bottom, there are actually things like vector motion blur and things like that that we can start to add. But really, I find that one of my favorite ways of doing motion blur is to switch my renderer from the standard renderer to the physical renderer. Now when I turn this on, now we have this additional physical tab over here on my render settings. And here in the physical tab, we can start to enable things like motion blur. Now this physical renderer that we have here, this is something that if you're using Cinema 4D Prime, you won't have this feature, but any of the higher tier packages of Cinema 4D should have this physical renderer feature. So in here, I'm just simply going to turn on motion blur. And that should be all that I have to do. So now, if I come in here, if you recall from one of the earlier lessons, if you use something like the interactive render region, you won't see any motion blur. And that's because the interactive render region does not show you that. It does not calculate that as part of the renderer. So if you want to see your motion blur, you're actually going to have to render into the picture viewer. Again, you can either do that through the render menu, or you can use your keyboard shortcut, which is Shift-R. So let's come in here and render this into the picture viewer. And give this just a moment. Now once we get into the picture viewer, this is going to render now a full quality image. So as a result, this is going to take quite a bit longer compared to what we were getting with the interactive render region. And at this point now you can start to see where the global illumination is being calculated. And again, that's where a lot of our render time is going to be going now. So we'll give this just a moment. You can now start to see some of our motion blur beginning to appear here as this ship starts to kind of speed away. There we go, very nice. So you can see we have things like motion blur that are on the ship as it starts to kind of zoom out of frame. We can even start to see some blurring on the background. So as the camera starts to pan over and try to follow this aircraft as it's going away, we can even start to see the background blur a little bit. Now you will notice as you maybe zoom in here a little bit closer that the motion blur is fairly grainy and kind of noisy, and really that's probably going to be okay because there is going to be so much motion happening. Even if there is a little bit of graininess here, you really won't even notice it. In fact, it'll probably make it look a little bit more realistic, like real film grain. So in my case, I'm really just going to leave my physical renderer settings pretty much at their default. Now one last thing that I want to add in here before we set off our final render is if I go back to sort of the beginning of my sequence, and let's come in here, and again I'll just render another image here into the picture viewer. Again, that's going to be Shift-R on my keyboard, and give this just a moment to calculate. Again, it's going to go through and do all of my global illumination calculation for my image-based lighting. Okay, so here's the image once it's finished rendering. Now one of the things that I would like to come in here and do is if I zoom in here a little bit tighter, if you recall from the previous lesson I had mentioned that one of the things with this global illumination is that it's sometimes not always good at generating the really sharp contact shadows that we may sometimes want. So in my case you can see where maybe there's not quite as much of a nice dark shadow underneath this landing gear that we might want. Maybe trying to get a few more of these kind of darker sort of indirect shadows that we may want to see here. Cinema 4D has a feature built in called ambient occlusion, which is really, really good for this. It's sort of a cheat, kind of a fake, but it looks really, really nice once it's been applied. So once again, I'm going to open up my render settings for this, and I'm just going to use the keyboard shortcut, which is Control B. Again, B as in boy. And what we're going to do is go down to our effect and add in an ambient occlusion calculation. So there's ambient occlusion. In here we can start to determine a minimum and a maximum ray length. Essentially this is going to be really, really good for simulating kind of indirect ambient shadowing. And with the minimum and maximum ray length, we can tell Cinema 4D how far we want those shadows to expand in any direction. So typically you want your ambient occlusion to be relatively subtle. So in my case, I'm probably going to leave this at the default of about 100 centimeters. So let's just see what we get with the default ambient occlusion enabled and turned on. So I'll just go ahead and render this into the picture viewer as well. Again, Shift R on my keyboard. I'll give this just a moment to calculate. Okay, so I've just paused this for a moment while I let this render finish. You can see over in my render times that adding this ambient occlusion really didn't increase my render time by, in my case, it really didn't increase it at all. But if you take a look at what I had before and compare that to what I have now, again, it's a fairly subtle difference, but you can see now with the ambient occlusion how it just sort of helps to add a little bit more visual punch to some of these contact shadows. And also in areas where maybe geometry starts to touch, where we might want, again, just sort of these subtle little indirect shadowing effects, it really just kind of helps to add that final little bit of visual pop to the render. So I like to use ambient occlusion whenever possible, and especially I like to use it whenever using global illumination, because the two work together really, really well to have both the direct lighting, the indirect lighting, and these really, really nice detailed little contact shadows. Okay, so at this point now, we're pretty much ready to set off our final render. So in our next lesson, we'll talk about some of the options that we can set up in our render settings to output our final rendered animation.